Today we are looking at the how much question in the Advanced Higher History paper. Now the how much question is relatively straightforward. It is a question that asks you to look at two different sources, but in general is really just two how fully questions shoved together. It is relatively straightforward and allows you the opportunity to gain quite a few marks from interpreting points from the source, and then quite a lot of marks from bringing in some of your own knowledge. So how much questions, as I say, are very straightforward. Two how fully questions basically stuck together. Now they will ask you about differing views or differing interpretations in some way. For example, they may ask you about differing views about the effectiveness of the British Army, or differing interpretations of the reasons why the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic, or differing views on the causes of inequality in Britain. But you treat them exactly as a how fully question, although they use that kind of fancier language. It's just two how fully questions put together, and the kind of fancy language is just a way of acknowledging the fact that the two sources tend to disagree on quite a few key points. The mark breakdown is as follows. Again, pretty straightforward. The SQA says you've got to establish a view of the source, provide wider contextual development in order to explain different interpretations, and think about different other possible interpretations. So that's really just historiography. So the marks are 6 marks for interpreting the information in each source. So you can get 3 marks from one source and 3 marks for the other. You cannot divide those up. You can't have 4 and 2 or 5 and 1. It's got to be 3 and 3. 8 marks for the wider contextual development, which is obviously omissions, other points of view, so more historiography. Wider contextual development means just adding points to the things in the source, and then finally 2 marks for historiography. So 3 marks for each source, 6 marks in total for interpretation, 8 marks for the stuff the source doesn't say, and 2 marks for historiography. As we said before, in the how fully question, interpretation just means quoting a relevant point from the source, explaining why the quote is relevant to the question. So basically explaining what the quote means in terms of the question. For example, you'll say, source A says, blah, 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 blah. This shows that, whatever. Source A says something about submarines. This shows that one of the big problems in the Battle of the Atlantic was that it was very difficult for aircraft to locate submarines early on, something like that. Wider contextual development, as we said, 8 marks here. Detailed, accurate and relevant points. So relevant, accurate and detailed, or RAD, as I sometimes like to say. They can give further detail about issues raised in the question, in the source, or highlight points the source fails to mention. So it can be that they said, many airmen died during the campaign to attack Germany, but you might know the specific number, and if you do know the specific number and you mention it, then you get a mark for that. As I said, and I said this for the how fully question, in many ways it can be easier to highlight points that are just totally missed out, because then you don't really have to kind of worry about whether you're being specific or not. But sometimes reading the source will jog your memory about a specific detail, so it might say, developments were introduced by certain key figures, but you might know the names of these key figures, and then you get points for giving more detail. When we're doing wider contextual development, when we're doing these omission points, they've got to be relevant. They've got to answer the question. If they don't answer the question, if they're accurate and detailed but not relevant, then you don't get any marks for them. So make sure they are relevant to the question. That's one of the things that we tend to fall down on. And then finally, of course, historiography. Just 2 marks for explaining historians' views. Relatively simple sentence, but has to reflect the question. Has to indicate what their opinion would be on the issue at hand. For example, A.J.B. Taylor argues that the bombing campaign was a failure as it harmed the British economy more than it damaged the German economy. Not a lot of complexity there, but you do get a mark. And there's some great historians with some pictures, including some people getting awards from the royal family. Jolly good. These are the how much questions over the last 10 years or so. So you can see you've got a range of different questions, and then I've helpfully provided a key, and so it's either an autobiography, a primary source, or a historian. So you can see it's a bit of a mix. Generally, you get one historian. Well, you always get one historian and something else. Sometimes you get two historians. So in 2019, you got Roy Jenkins with his autobiography, although Roy Jenkins is also a historian, a very good one as well. And Kevin Jeffries, who is also a historian now. Roy Jenkins is a bit of an autobiography in that one because he was actually a Labour politician. So when he's talking about the 1945 Labour election, then it becomes a bit of a kind of blurring of the lines, much in the same way that Churchill, providing details about the Second World War, kind of blurs the line between eyewitness and memoir and historian. Okay, going back to 2018, Churchill's wartime leadership, got the impact of the Blitz, Chamberlain's resignation, challenges for land and sea and land forces, which in some ways was a very hard question, but in other ways you could literally talk about anything in the whole war, and so it was very wide. Significance of the phony war, effectiveness of bombing, challenges of land and sea forces, the 45 election, coalition government, and impact of the Blitz. So we can see with those, they're big issues. They are things that are wide in terms of what you can talk about. There's a lot of detail in them. They're not very kind of small aspects of the course. You know, Churchill's wartime leadership or the 1945 election win. These are things that you can talk about at length. So for the two source question, the how much question, you're going to get a lot of detail. Finally, just to give you a little bit of an example of what a question like that looked like, which one is this? What did I just made this one up? So this is a source from Churchill as a War Leader by the historian Richard Lamb. You can see it goes on about Chamberlain. Actually, this is the Chamberlain one. So it's 2016 question. So you've got detail about that kind of stuff, and then you've got another source about from John Charnley talking about various other things to do with Churchill, and then the question overall asks about the differing interpretations of the effectiveness of Churchill's wartime leadership. So ignore the nonsense I was talking about it being a Chamberlain question. It is a Churchill question, so you've got two sources in Churchill, obviously a big thing, and then you would have to give some detail about what the first source says, 3 points, what the second source says, again 3 points, and then you can provide some wider contextual development. Now, in the marking instructions, it suggests that you do the first source points and then some wider contextual development, and then the second source and then wider contextual development. I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's much better to do the source points from both the sources and then move on to your wider contextual development, because that means that you're much more likely not to repeat yourself or not to try and include a point in your omissions that is actually mentioned in one of the sources. So do both sources first. So do all the source points, all 6 source points, then the 8 contextual development points, and then finally the historiography points. As I say, relatively straightforward. I don't know how straightforward I've made it sound here, but it's just 2 how-fully questions, so it's just a chance for you to give specific detail. And remember, that is the really key thing, being relevant and giving specific detail. And there's nothing wrong with putting something down if it turns out to be wrong. You think, oh, I think this might be true. Is this something? Quite often when people complete these questions, they do 6 source points, 8 omissions, and 2 historiography points. And sometimes I feel that, it's nothing wrong with putting 2 or 3 extra source points in just in case you're wrong about one of them. No negative marking. You could have 16 right points and 24 wrong points and you still get 16 marks. So don't worry about writing things that are wrong. Nothing bad will happen to you. Hopefully that has explained the general ideas behind the how much question